Yes, we had a speaker who couldn't be with us, but I have his speech. I have the message here. I'll be reading this for Dr. Yang Jianli. He says, "Good afternoon. Today we gather together to welcome the Human Rights Torch to come to New York, and more than this, to ask people of conscience in this great city to speak out against China's continued violation of human rights and to support in any way possible the civilian protests in China. As you may know, a series of protests under the name of Human Rights Torch has begun in China 3 weeks ago. As one of the originators of these activities, I want to remind every one of you of the very reason why we must confront the Chinese government with human rights issues in the time leading up to the Olympics in Beijing. It is simple and clear. The Chinese government is doing everything in its power to bless its atrocity against humanity with Olympic gold. You might be aware that this is China's second attempt to host the coveted role of Olympic host. Its first attempt in 1991, in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre, was denied. 10 years later, with the harrowing cries of the victims of Tiananmen faded and almost forgotten, its second attempt was successful. But I stand here today knowing that there are still thousands of smaller Tiananmen squares all over mainland China and in Tibet and in Darfur. And I stand here today knowing that the newly created Chinese Olympic slogan, "One World, One Dream," is the furthest thing from the truth in China. For I dare say that the Chinese government's dream is not the same as the dream of Mr. Hu Jia's activist wife, Zhang Jinyan, and their three-month-old daughter, who have now been under house arrest for more than 200 days. Hu Jia was sentenced to 3 years and 6 months in prison and joined Olympic dissidents including Yang Jianli, detained in July 2007 for his involvement in a petition, "We want human rights, not the Olympics," signed by farmers protesting land seizures. Nor is it the same dream as the dream of Mr. Yi Guizhou, who is serving a 4-year prison sentence for organizing protests against Olympics-related forced evictions, and Wang Lin, sentenced to 15 months of re-education in November 2007 for opposing the demolition of her property for an Olympics-related project. Does she and the Chinese government share the same dream? The list goes on. Think of Chen Guangchun, the blind rural activist from my home, Shandong province, who was sentenced to 4 years and 3 months in prison in retaliation for his exposing forced abortions and sterilizations in eastern China. His verdict came less than a week after a closed-door trial at which he had been deprived of his defense team. Or Dr. Wang Binzhan, who was abducted in Vietnam by Chinese secret agents and held secretly for 6 months before his arrest was even announced, and later sentenced to life in prison. And human rights attorney Tung Bao, who was abducted on March 6th of this year and held for 40 hours by plainclothes thugs who identified themselves as officers of the Beijing Public Security Bureau. or Beijing-based human rights attorney Li Heping, who suffered a back injury when his car was rammed by an unmarked police vehicle and 3 police officers who he said had been shadowing him since January of this year. Think of the Tibetan monks, with unknown numbers of them slaughtered just last month, who are not allowed to practice their religion freely and who must endure constant patriotic education, requiring them to study government propaganda and write denunciations of the Dalai Lama. What is their dream? Ask the Falun Gong practitioners. Ask underground house church members. What is their dream? Is it the one dream of the Chinese government? No, that is not their dream. It is their nightmare. One world, one nightmare might be the more appropriate slogan for Chinese people who thirst for basic human rights and dignity. And that's akin to a barren, parched desert where it never rains. The time has come to tell the Chinese government that human rights are not for sale. The Chinese government must hear that it cannot benefit from Olympic gold and at the same time deny its citizens the benefits of human rights. We call on world leaders, friends of human rights, scholars, athletes, and all members of the entertainment and business communities to follow the brave lead of movie director Steven Spielberg and French President Sarkozy. Like Mr. Spielberg and President Sarkozy, we must now answer the question, how much abuse can we tolerate? If we do not make this stand now, our silence will send a loud message to Beijing, a message that will return to haunt us. In the words of the beloved Martin Luther King Jr., in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Thank you for your support.
Yep.